Hello, I'm Penelope Maver, and welcome to Earth Converse podcast, where we explore our relationship and conversations with the earth, all in the hope of inspiring a deeper connection with ourselves, each other, and the earth that is our home. And I've mentioned a couple of times on my podcast that I collaborate Impact International, and I have great pleasure of having the founder and the boss here, David Williams, who's been important in my life for that reason. And I know that nature has been a great source of grounding, belonging, connection, inspiration, and healing today. And so he'll tell his story, his farming background, and Outward Bound, and how it led to Impact International. And he's got views on maybe how to heal through walking. I'm not too sure. He'll tell, and also a vision for the future, reimagining the future in these times. So, Dave, welcome, and yeah, let's just start. So, I know start at the earliest memory.
Hi, Penny. Nice to be with you.
Yeah.
Earliest memory.
Mm.
Well, I guess the earliest important memory was my early childhood, which was spent in a place called Lathkill, which is one of the dales in Derbyshire in the Peak District National Park. And I moved there at 4 years old with my family. My dad was the youngest brother of a family of four children, and grew up on a farm elsewhere. And of course, if you're the youngest son, you don't get entitled to take over the farm when you graduate. So luckily, my mother had an uncle who had never married and was coming towards the end of his life, and he offered this farm up to us to move to. So we moved from the middle of Britain to the Peak District National Park. As I say, I was 4 years old. There was my mum and dad, myself, and my brother at that time. And this farm had not been touched or developed since my mum's uncle's parents had passed away. So we were farming with 2 Shire horses. We didn't have a tractor. We were milking cows by hand. I say I was 5 years old. This is what my dad was doing.
Yeah.
We had no electricity. We had no running water. We had a massive stone-built tank at the back of the house that collected water off the roof, and that water was then brought into the house with an old lead pipe to the one tap in the kitchen, which is where I remember having my morning wash before setting off to school, stood in the window. And we had no bathroom. So Sundays was bath day. We used to get this old zinc bath out of the shed and put it in front of the fire and fill it up with hot water. And by this time, as well as the 4 of us, my younger sister had been born. And so she would get bathed first, and then my younger brother, and then me, and then my mother, and then my dad. And my dad used to say that he came out of the bath dirtier than when he went in. That was so it sounds like poverty, but it wasn't.
Yeah.
I mean, when I look back on it, I realised that we didn't have a lot of the trappings that many of the people same age as me would have had at the time. But it didn't feel like poverty. It felt like an idyllic way of growing up. Living on a farm on the sides of a beautiful dale in the middle of the Peak District National Park, and learning to be a farmer. I used to go to school in a little village which was about 3 or 4 miles away. So I used to have to catch the bus every morning through into this school, the Church of England school. There were 14 children in the school. So we'd have an assembly, and then they'd put a screen across the middle of the one room, and the kids who were under 7 would go to school at one side of the screen, and those of us that were over 7 would go to the other side. So they were my earliest beginnings. And I have nothing but fond memories then. And I think that's when I realised that I had an affinity for the outdoors. I realised I loved being surrounded by animals and surrounded by nature. You know, I couldn't wait to get out of the house in the morning, and I went back into the house last thing at night as late as I possibly could. So that's maybe where a lot of the early experiences influenced my kind of later career path. When I got to the age of about 10, foot and mouth had hit Britain. My dad had expanded the farm, perhaps a little bit more rapidly than he should have. We'd installed a generator, so we now had power to milk the cows, and we had one electric light in the house that could only be put on when we weren't milking the cows because it would overpower the generator. We'd brought running water in from wherever via Alcathene pipe. We still didn't have a bathroom. The toilet was a little kind of bucket in the coal shed, and it became clear to my mum and dad that they'd basically borrowed too much money to grow the farm, and with foot and mouth and the restrictions on trading, so you can't sell or buy cattle or sheep, they weren't going to be able to meet all of their requirements with the bank, so they made the difficult decision to sell up. And that was a very, very difficult time for me because I can remember the day as if it was yesterday. You know, the auctioneer arrives. There's a guy arrived in a burger van and gave me a free burger. I remember. Well, that's all I got after the day. And then you just watched everything that my parents had worked so hard for going round in a circle as the auctioneer was selling things off. He even tried to sell my dog. Thank God I managed to save that. And then off we went, and we moved to another little house in another little village where I went to another school. This time, you know, it's massive. There were 35 kids in this school, and no bathroom. We had electricity. We had running water, no bathroom. Toilet at the bottom of the garden this time, a long drop. And that's where I stayed and managed to pass my 11 plus, which is the exam you take in the UK to decide whether you go to grammar school or not, and I passed it. So I then started going to the big school in Buxton in Derbyshire, Buxton Grammar School. I was the only kid from my junior school to go. So again, you know, this was 400 kids. This is massive for me. So I'm meeting these kids for the very first time. And trying to make my way in the world. Can't play football, can't play cricket. I was quite good at running, so I got into the cross-country team. And you know, that kind of background had kind of steeped me in this experience of nature. Always living in the countryside, living very, very close to nature. But it also made me quite shy, quite introverted. So it took me a while to kind of start coming out of my shell at school. And then when I was 16, we actually moved again into town, and we had a proper bathroom. So when I was 16, I was sitting in the bath thinking, this is ours, this is great.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was kind of early experiences. I learned lots about farming, obviously. I think I learned a lot about how to work with animals and how to respect them and how to work with them as opposed to trying to dominate them. So even at the age of 5, it was my job to go and fetch the cows from 3 or 4 fields away, bring them down the main road twice a day for milking. You know, I've got fantastic memories of haymaking when all the families would come together and help each other, and just a joyous experience of growing up in a beautiful place, in what is now perhaps best described as regenerative farming. You know, we were this was not a high input, high output farm. It was a small holding, and you worked with the land. You learned how to work with the land and not despite the land. So we didn't bring artificial fertilizers into the farm. You know, we used the manure from the cattle and spread that out, You know, we had a strict crop rotation, you know, albeit there weren't a lot of crops being grown in Derbyshire, but we had a strict crop rotation, so you didn't grow the same thing in the same field 2 years on the trot. You know, it wasn't a hand-to-mouth existence, but it wasn't far from it. But it was happy, you know, and you learned to live within your means, you know.
Yeah.
I remember wearing clothes that my mother had made, you know, and I remember watching my grandma unpick woolen jumpers so she could reknit them, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
We had rag rugs around the floor, you know. And like I say, I didn't feel like we were poor. But at the same time, when I was old enough to compare myself to other people, I realised I'd had a very different childhood to most.
And the loss of the family home and the farm, if you worked so hard for it, that must have been devastating, and feeling the effect of your parents seeing it.
Yeah, that was a particularly memorable moment. And I can remember sitting away from it all because it was just too much to take in.
Yeah.
I can remember sitting away from it all with my dog, saving her from being auctioned, and realizing that this farming life was probably not for me anymore, because you know, to have a farming life, you need a farm, and we hadn't got a farm anymore.
Yeah.
And I can remember even then, at the age of 10, thinking, "Wow, you know, what am I going to do? What am I going to do with my life now?" And
that's a big question for a 10-year-old.
Exactly. Yeah. But I've always been a driven person, and I think the drive started then. I thought, you know, I'm going to have to make my own way in the world somehow.
Wow.
Even at the age of 10.
Wow, the responsibility of that, or the feeling of that.
Yeah.
So at 16, you're in the city. So the 16-year-old with all his hormones and So where was? What was happening?
So 16. You know, so I don't know what was happening then. I was definitely missing living in the countryside, but I was also enjoying being a 16-year-old, you know, and all the things that 16-year-olds enjoy doing, with friends that I could see in the evenings instead of being on my own in the sticks. But there was something happening there, and I remember, first of all, sitting down with the careers guidance guy at school as you're approaching we call them GCEs, you know, your kind of 16-year-old exams. What are you going to do? What are you going to do with your life now, Williams? This career advisor, first of all, said, so have you considered becoming an apprentice at the Ferodo brake linings factory, which was the only factory in the area? And I said, I've considered it, and I'm definitely not going to do it. There's no way I could be locked up in a factory for 8 hours a day. And he says, well, in that case, what's it to be? Army, Navy, or Air Force? And that was, you know, as far as this particular careers guidance counsellor could go with his imagination. And I took him seriously, you know, and I thought, right, okay, well, Navy, let's go and see the world. So I actually applied to join the Navy, and I wanted to be a helicopter pilot.
Cool.
That'll be the perfect job for me. And of course, you know, you go to the recruitment office and they're all smiles and yes, we'll have you, you know, and this is what you can do and this is where you're going to travel to. But at the end of all of those entrance exams, most of which I passed with flying colours, they then landed it on me that I would need a physics O level to be trained as a helicopter pilot, amongst other things. And I wasn't even studying physics, so that ruled that out. And then they tried to persuade me to be what they called an artificer, which is basically somebody who mends helicopters. It didn't have quite the same attraction. So I thought, well, that's not to be. And at the same time, probably because of this kind of excitement for travel and the sea, I applied to go on the Rotary Club in Buxton. Had one ticket a year to sail on the Winston Churchill, which is a tall-masted ship. And something about this fascinated me, and I thought I would really like to do this. So off my own bat, I applied for it. None of my mates applied for it. They all thought I was a bit weird doing it. And I got all the way through all the interviews and fell at the last hurdle because I found out later someone with better connections than me
Mm.
was able to secure that ticket.
Mm.
And it must have been a conversation of some importance in the staff room at school, because within a couple of weeks, the PE teacher at school approached me and said, "Look, we get 2 tickets every year for an Outward Bound course, and we'd like to offer it to you."
Is that
And
how it
so,
came about?
yeah, exactly. Without this, I wouldn't be where I am now.
Life is what happens when you're making other plans, or
Exactly.
yeah, actually you think you get disappointed by something that you can't achieve, and then actually this comes up.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Well, I call them pivotal moments,
Mm.
so I can track back through my life when the pivotal moments were.
Yeah.
Those times that stay with you forever,
Yeah.
usually where you make a significant decision,
Yes.
and then carry out on that decision. Yeah. So that summer, the summer of 1972, giving my age away now, I went off to Outward Bound. I got on the train and off we went. Off I went on my own, and eventually found myself at a place called Aberdyfi Outward Bound in Wales. I'd never heard of Outward Bound. I didn't know what to expect. And I rocked up at this outdoor centre with another 120, I would call them men. I think I was probably the youngest on the course. Most of them were kind of aged 18 to 21. And we were put into a watch of 12 lads with an instructor. And there were 12 watchers. And I began 4 weeks that changed my life. I think Outward Bound changes everybody's life, but it certainly changed mine. And I became aware of the fact that I was lucky enough to be at the very first Outward Bound centre that had started internationally by Kurt Hahn, the big German philosopher who helped to establish Aberdyfi Outward Bound back in the late 40s as a result of his partner was in business, or in the Outward Bound movement, was from the Blue Funnel Line. And what he'd recognised during the war with the merchant shipping lines that were running between America and Britain and being attacked by U-boats, what they'd recognised was that a lot of the young lads who were on boats that had been torpedoed were giving up before they needed to. They were getting into the lifeboats and then assuming all was gone. And so the initial idea behind Outward Bound was to take people who were working as merchant seamen, young lads who were working as merchant seamen, and strengthen their character, increase their resilience, is what we call it now.
Yeah.
In those days, they called it character training.
Yeah.
So I experienced 4 weeks of what Kurt Hahn had designed many, many years before. And it was indeed character training. We were up at 6 o'clock every morning for a run. They call it a run and a dip. You had to jump in the sea. It was June, but the sea was still cold, and do a bit of a swim in the sea. And then you do your duties around the centre and kind of get all of your jobs done. And then there'd be breakfast, and then there'd be an assembly while we watched the flag raised, and an inspirational talk from one of the instructors. And then you'd be off for your day's activities, which included sailing, kayaking, rock climbing, abseiling, orienteering, big expeditions over the mountains, and most of it self-reliant. You were kind of expected to take responsibility for yourself and your own safety, learn how to navigate, lots of PE and kind of swimming and physical activities, a massive ropes course. And everything I did there, I was doing for the first time. And everything I did there made me realize that I had capabilities beyond my imagination. I was successful at all of these things. The one thing I was good at was running, and I won the cross-country race. And, that kind of gave me quite a lot of confidence. But the other thing was that on the first night that I got there, I had a little chat with myself, and I said, right, okay, you're quite shy, you're quite introverted. To survive this 4 weeks, you're going to have to bring yourself out of your shell a little. So that first night in the dormitory, or bunkhouse, I can't remember what we called it, I decided to tell a few jokes, and they went down so well. I told a few more jokes, and I probably kept people giggling until the early hours of the morning. And they then nicknamed me Spike as a result, as I've been Spike Milligan. So that was the name that stuck for the rest of the 4 weeks.
I love that. I love that you set that intention and this, that you're using this opportunity and that stretch. And it also sounds like your own rite of passage from a lad to a man. This is a good ground for young men to really know their potential and to that physical challenge and rigor and resilience and to emerge out of that.
Absolutely. And for anyone listening to this who's had a similar experience, and it's important to emphasize that outward bound is often an abused phrase. It's a bit similar to a Hoover.
Yeah.
There's only one Hoover. There are lots of outdoor courses. There's only one outward bound.
Yeah.
And anyway, some of the other things we did were life-saving. So we provided a patrol on the beach. We were involved in mountain rescue. We were involved in the lifeboats, launching the lifeboats. We did a lot of community work with local farmers. And it was a really grounding experience that had a massive effect on me. And it wasn't very sophisticated in that there was no one there helping you to interpret it or sit down at the end of the day and say, what did that mean to you? You had to do all of that for yourself.
Yeah.
But I was clever enough to realize that this was an opportunity that I needed to make the most of. And then we got to the end of the course, and I got my little badge, my outward bound badge, and got on the train to set off home. I remember this as if it was yesterday as well. So every time the train stopped, there's 120 of us got on the train at the beginning. Every time the train stopped, people would get off, big farewells, big goodbyes, or I'd get off onto another train with some other people, and eventually I ended up at Buxton Station on my own, crying my eyes out, and crying because it had finished, crying because I was confused, that I was coming back to a place that I'd left, and when I left I was a different person.
Returning and all these emotions.
Absolutely, really confused, really messed up. And this is the next pivotal moment. So at that point I said to myself, whatever these people have done to me, I want to do it to other people. I don't know what you call it, but that's what my career is going to be.
And no matter sort of all that sort of even uncomfortableness, like actually I want even them to feel that, because that confusion and because something's moving with that.
Absolutely.
And then and the transference, like I don't know what it is, but I want that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd learned to do things I never thought I could do. I'd recognized that I could choose the kind of person I wanted to be and experiment with that and build confidence in that. I'd recognized that I was pretty good at forming relationships that I didn't think I was. I was quite good as a leader. And I wanted, rather than wanting to become all of that myself, I wanted to give other people the chance to experience that. And the best language I had for it at the time was an instructor, because that's what we had there, group instructors. But this is back in when we're back in 1972 here, and there were no places you could go to get a degree in instructing. It wasn't heard of. But what I was intelligent enough to realize was that I'd probably have a better chance of doing that if I stayed on at school for a couple more years and did some A levels and perhaps went on to further education from there. So I went straight back to see the headmaster, because I'd already told him 6 weeks earlier that I was leaving. And I said, look, I've changed my mind. I'd like to stay. And by that time I'd got my O-level results, and they were a lot better than everybody expected. So they were quite happy to have me stay. And I did another 2 years at school through to my A levels, which again, I did quite well with.
Did it include physics?
No.
Bravo.
But what I did do during those 2 years is because, in the sixth form, you get as much free time as you get study time. So I used my free time to help out at the local junior school. So I kind of learned a little bit about how it was to teach kids. And I was a really good swimmer as well as a good runner. And they gave me a chance to teach them in the swimming pool as well. So I learned how to be a swimming instructor over those 2 years. I learned how to be a lifeguard instructor. So I was getting the kind of basic skills together without having access to all of the outdoor activities that I was really inspired by. And then as I came towards the end of those 2 years, the teachers approached me and said, look, you're doing really well with geography. You should go on to university and study geography. And I says, well, that's not going to help me do to others what they did to me. And so I started looking around on my own, and I eventually recognized that training as a teacher was probably going to be the closest skill set that I would need. And then I also recognized that I needed to find a place where that could be delivered in the outdoors. And I came across, in my research, this place called Charlotte Mason College in Ambleside, where there was a course being run by a guy called Colin Mortlock, who was the pioneer of adventure education. And I could train to be a teacher while specialising in adventure education. So it was the dream ticket, the absolute ticket. So I applied, I got an interview, my dad took me up for the interview, I passed the interview, and I was offered a place. And so that was the place for me then. I turned my back on university and went to teach training college instead. It was run under Lancaster University, but it was a place where you learned to be a teacher.
Yeah.
And it was steeped in the history, funnily enough, of what we now call experiential learning. So the lady, Charlotte Mason, she was the first person, she was dead a long time before I went, but she was the first person to train teachers in the UK. And she was actually training nannies, and she was training them to deliver education outside. So she, nature walks, learning from nature, here we go again. So it was all around me while I was at Charlotte Mason College. This learning from the outdoors was all around me. It wasn't just about the adventure education. It was also how people learnt about geography, how people learnt about maths, English, chemistry. All of this was delivered through experience. And so again, I got really excited about how all of these kind of coincidences were coming together and pointing me in the right direction. So
I love also the steps towards it, like you didn't have access to the big outdoor activities, but then where are the opportunities of going into helping juniors or the swimming, just the steps towards that, and also being clear about your vision, being sort of open of what comes in. But I don't need to be in the university, no matter how much you think geography could be, but actually just sticking to your vision. And then I suppose it's the sort of once again the container of nature, like being the source and the overall teacher and I don't know, stakeholder in that.
So during that time, I started to put things together, and I'd had this incredibly powerful experience at Outward Bound, and I was now being educated by a person who wrote on the philosophy of adventure, and started to bring all these ideas together and recognize that my journey was going to be about helping people change their behavior, change the way they are, change the way they see the world through adventure in the outdoors. And that became very quickly, my passion and my vision and my desire. And so I left college after 3 years, worked for a new organization that was running adventure holidays for kids, and worked really hard through that first summer delivering 7-day adventure holidays. And we delivered these holidays as if they were Outward Bound courses. I mean, these kids got an incredible experience. They did everything, and we did everything with them. And I got to the end of that summer, and it was quite satisfying, but I couldn't see how that was ever going to be a career. We then, in the same organization, were lucky enough to be part of some pioneering work with young unemployed people who, through government schemes, were given opportunities to train in different skills. And our job was to run a 5-day residential for them in what we called life and social skills. So, you know, how do you form relationships? How do you lead teams? How do you communicate? And again, we used the outdoors and a residential setting to achieve all of that. So that was exciting. It was pilot, it was brand new. And we got amazing results from it. During my time at college, I was able to persuade the powers that be that instead of doing a teacher training practice in a school for, you know, you used to do a big one in the middle of your course in the second year. Instead of doing that, I managed to persuade them to send me back to Outward Bound. So I was on the other side of the fence now, and I was there down at Abu Dhabi with a few of the people who were there when I'd been a student.
Lovely.
But learning how to deliver this incredible experience, which was really powerful. And I remember inviting Colin Mortlock down there to see what we were up to, because he was a little bit skeptical of the Outward Bound movement, but you know, after he saw us in action and saw what we were up to, then I think he was quite impressed with what we were learning and what we were doing. And then so I decided to go back again to Outward Bound. I went back to Outward Bound a year after I'd left college, and worked there for about 6 months, £12 a week. You know, I've never been famous for paying a lot of money. And at that time, the inference when you work there was you'd only do it for 2 or 3 years and then you get a proper job. So there still wasn't a career in this line of work. And I enjoyed working there on that second occasion as well. But I was starting to see some of the limitations in terms of, you know, my ability to innovate new ideas. It was a very, very tried and tested environment, and it was quite difficult to do things differently.
Yeah, they'd had a sort of formula or rigidity around that. Yeah.
And at the same time, the business model was starting to become a bit strange. You know, 4 weeks is a long time for people to spend away from work or away from home or away from school or whatever. Anyway, rightly or wrongly, at the end of about 6 months, I thought, okay, I'm not going to be able to build the career I need, the lifelong career I need, working here. So I went back to the Lake District, the place that has become my home, the place that I love, and worked for that first company again for a little while as the director of training at the age of 22, where we did even more pioneering work with the National Coal Board, people beginning their careers as first line supervisors. And young people from the post office, as well as lots more government-backed schemes. And I was also given the freedom to start experimenting with using the outdoors as a way of helping young offenders to correct their behaviour, you know, in a kind of facilitated developmental way, as opposed to providing them as a punishment.
And what was it about the outdoors that helped that process?
Well, it was, you know, I did this work at that time, and it's also how we started with Impact. The methodology was something called intermediate treatment, and basically the magistrates would identify kids who were at risk because they'd committed a crime and were kind of starting to descend into that circular life of crime, punishment. But something somewhere, somebody had seen something somewhere that would give them the confidence or the optimism that they could be turned around. So they'd be formed up into these kids, again, usually boys, typically aged 16 to 18. They'd be put into groups of 9 with a probation officer. And the rule was if they could spend 6 months out of trouble and met rigorously their probation officer for an evening every week, and participated in our program, then at the end of that 6 months, they would leave scot-free and there'd be no blemish on their character. But they were troubled kids, these, you know, they weren't easy to work with. And so we used to do a weekend at the beginning of that. And that was tough. These kids hadn't met each other before. They were all kind of trying to work out who was the biggest, who was the best, who was the bravest. And the first experience we gave them was we would typically meet them at a car park with their probation officer and put them into our minibus, and we'd drive up to this area of the lakes that is very, very quiet out on the western fells. And we had a little kind of bunkhouse that we ran the program from up there where no one was going to disturb us and we were not going to disturb anyone else. And on the way there, there's a very narrow river gorge with probably about a 15-foot cliff on the side of it into very deep water. And so, winter, spring, summer, whatever the weather, we would stop the minibus outside this little gorge. We hadn't said anything to any of them at this point. We're just listening to them bickering in the background and doing the things that boys do when they're trying to show how great they are. And we'd and we'd kind of get them out the minibus and stand on the edge of this little cliff above the water. And one of us would say something provocative like, "Let's see how hard you really are." You had to make it into a challenge. And then one of us would jump in the water and the other one would stay on the top there with them and say, "Right, off you go, one after the other." And inevitably, the kids in the the bus that had said nothing would be the first to jump. And the ones that had been the loudest and the most cocky and the most confident would be the ones that you'd had to encourage to get over the edge. And that was the beginning of the weekend.
Yeah.
And then the rest of the weekend was spent just creating an environment.
Yeah.
But it was fantastically
That's
powerful.
a nice equaler. Yeah. And I even like the sort of the shock therapy, the cold water sort of, that consciousness or that challenge, or, it's quite sort of,
Again,
right
completely
to
safe. But total elation. You get them in the minibus afterwards and they really
invigorating. I'm alive. I'm in my body. Yeah.
One of the many philosophies that I came across when I was training was that, why do young people offend? You could argue that it's their own form of adventure.
Yes.
If you can find a more acceptable outlet for that adventure, which is what we were doing, then they don't need to offend because they're getting it elsewhere. Anyway, so 3 or 4 weeks later, we'd do a whole week with them. And that's when we went for the behavior change. And during that week, you'd move from being disciplinarian and kind of adult on your case through to being one of your best mates. And you'd use that kind of mentoring experience and that kind of counseling experience to help them really explore what was going on in their life, what they could change, what they couldn't change, and how they needed to react to some of the things that were happening. And at the end of that week, that they didn't want to leave you. They didn't want to leave the whole experience, similar to how I felt getting off the train at the end of the Outward Bound experience. These young people just didn't want to go back. But they were confident and they were able to go back. And we used to say to them at the end of that week, right, okay, if you can stay out of trouble and earn enough money to pay for your food and accommodation, we'll run a free weekend for you 3 months' time. And of course, that's a massive incentive because they want to come back and do it again.
Sure.
And it also forced them to be entrepreneurial.
And taking responsibility.
And then at the end of that 6 months, they'd come back for their final weekend. And the results we were getting from that work were just, not one child re-offended, not one young person re-offended during those 6-month experiences. I haven't tracked them, obviously didn't track them.
Sure.
So it was really powerful.
Beautiful. Had you started Impact at that point? Because I interrupted you.
Well, the story kind of blended into Impact. I got to a point where, again, I'm married now and I'm earning very, very little money. And the organization I was working for didn't feel that stable. And so, along with two other friends, we were talking one night. We said, well, why don't we do this for ourselves? And so we did. And that's how Impact started. And we started with no money at all.
Incredible.
We managed to create some relationships with other intermediate treatment groups that wanted to use the same methodology that we'd been pioneering. My main contact from the National Coal Board said, if you're setting up on your own, I'm coming with you. So we won that business right from the word go. And we managed to win some work with some local teams of apprentices. And so there was enough work there to make things happen. But most of the money, well, all of the money we made went straight into the business. We didn't draw any salary for the first 3 years. So it's pretty hard, you know. I mean, both of my partners had income coming in from their partners, from their wife's girlfriends. And I was living off my wife's earnings, and she'd just moved up to the area to be with me. And she was working as a hairdresser's assistant, so she wasn't earning a lot more. So I can remember, again, living in this rented cottage that was the absolute pits, and living off tinned tomatoes on toast for quite a long time.
Yeah, well, you're knowing poverty.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
As we started to build the company up from there. Yeah.
Yeah. And the sacrifices and knowing those, well, I suppose both the humble roots knew that you could do it.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
So things went from good to great. You know, it's the amount of commitment and passion we put into the work we did soon got the attention of people, and they started to use us, and the business started to grow. We had a major partnership fallout after 18 months. And that, again, was a pivotal moment. That's the time when I thought, do I give up now or do I carry on? Because every penny we'd made at that point was used to buy out the third partner and beyond.
That's tough. Yeah.
It was tough, yeah. You know, and then the rest is history, really. The organization grew and grew, and we've always stayed close to our values. We've always stayed close to the principles that we've used to develop people. And, you know, we started Impact in 1980, and around about 1983, we were lucky enough with our clients from the post office to come across an opportunity to provide similar experiences for civil servants working in the post office who were about to form a new organisation called British Telecom. British Telecom came out of the post office. British Telecom was to be an entrepreneurial, profit-making organisation as opposed to part of the government. So we started pioneering this program called the HIT course, High Impact Training, a 5-day experience for senior managers in the civil service in the post office who were going to move into, or already moved into, British Telecom. And it was fairly new for its time. You know, some people who didn't really know what it was about saw it as some kind of adventure holiday in the Lake District. Other people saw it as some kind of expensive military training. But the reality was, it was a very, very carefully designed experience that enabled managers to learn to be leaders and to inspire people and to, you know, bring out the very best in themselves as key people in this newly formed organisation. But it was of such interest to everybody that we were approached by, I think it was Granada the first time round, Granada, which was one of the ITV independent television companies. And they made a kind of short film that was put on the end of the 10 o'clock news. There used to be a slot at the end of the 10 o'clock news called "And Finally." It was usually a kind of tongue-in-cheek type of story. And this particular "And Finally" was how managers from the newly formed British Telecom were being trained in the Lake District, and there were pictures of these 55-year-old plus guys and girls floating down rivers on kayaks and fighting their way through snow, and you know, it was quite a thing. And off the back of that, we then did a breakfast time TV slot. We were then approached by the BBC for a half-hour program, and then Channel 4 did a 1-hour documentary on the work we were doing with the coal board. And before we knew it, everyone knew about us.
Wow.
And people were beating a path to our door for more of the same. And that's how we grew in the UK. And interestingly, that's what fueled our decision to buy our first hotel to run the programs from in 1985. And then in 1987, we were approached by an organization in Japan who'd seen one of those films and said, we really think this could work here. Do you want to come out here in partnership with us and see if you can make it work here? Which was my first big experience of working outside of the UK culture.
Yeah,
you know,
it's so different.
And from those successes in Japan, we then got the bug to grow the business globally. And so here we are now with 17 offices around the world.
Yeah, and 40 years, celebrating 40 years.
40 years this year, and what a weird time to celebrate it, eh? All the restrictions we've got in place. And you know, luckily we've been pioneering virtual experiential learning, and that has really kind of come to the fore now, as you can imagine, because the majority of work that we're doing globally is in the virtual space. So I'm very grateful that we started to work in that way probably 10 years ago now.
You've got a wonderful offering around that, and are bringing in it in a real experiential way. And what do you think in terms of that outdoors? What do you think that evokes in people? I mean, it evoked it in you, but in terms of people's consciousness and development and growth, what do you think that's so special about the outdoors?
So I'll get philosophical now, shall I?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Well, you know, my start point is we're all part of nature, and yet, you know, society has encouraged or enabled or pushed us quite a long way away from our natural roots, and I think most of us, either consciously or unconsciously, have a yearning to get back to that environment. I think we're naturally drawn towards the feelings that we get when we're in a natural environment. And whilst people feel comfortable in the city and in the town, and many people prefer that kind of way of life to a way of life in the outdoors, when you actually enable people to immerse themselves in a natural environment, an outdoor environment, they very quickly recognize something or realize that something is happening inside of them that perhaps they weren't expecting. There's a concept in Japan that has been prevalent for many, many years called Shinrin-raku. I think I've pronounced it right.
Yeah.
And the basic translation of that means to bathe in the forest. And it's a commonly accepted activity in Japan that, you know, probably on an annual basis or more often as required, when the stresses and strains of city life become too much to cope with, you take yourself off for a walk in the forest. You go on your own. You don't take anything with you along the lines of mobile phones. You enter the walk without any kind of idea or preconceptions about what you want to get out of the walk. And then you just wander. You wander through the forest, and when you've wandered for long enough, you re-emerge relaxed, at one with yourself, having benefited both physically and emotionally from that experience. And I think, to answer your question, I think there's an element of that that comes through to the surface when we bring people into that outdoor environment.
Mm.
And then we kind of spice it up a little bit as well. So we do a lot of work around what we call solos, where people will purposely spend time on their own in the outdoors, maybe considering a question, or maybe just asked to reflect on their life. Or, you know, my favorite question is, so how did you get to where you are now? And where are you going to go to next? And I think that's a great place to start a solo from.
Yeah.
But we also spice it up by putting people into experiences together collectively and asking them to explore each other's experiences. And I think people then, that learning environment is accelerated by sharing perspectives across a group and recognizing that different people react in different ways to exactly the same stimulus. And conversations again begin around how people are feeling differently and why they're feeling differently. You know, a night under the stars, a climb to the top of a peak and the views that come down from that, wandering up a river, you know, waist deep in water. These are all kind of these all emphasize how we can kind of mix and be at one with nature, and in return we benefit from that experience, either individually or collectively. I think adventure is an important part of that experience as well. So adventure for me is putting people into a situation where they're not 100% sure what the outcome is going to be. So there's that element of fear, that element of discomfort, that element of uncertainty that is, you know, where we talk about, everybody talks about being outside your comfort zone. That's where the learning happens. And it's true. That is where the learning happens. And again, the outdoors provide some fantastic opportunities for that to be created. I'm not saying that adventure has to happen in an outdoor environment, but it's very easy for us to create that.
Yeah, it's sort of a natural home for it.
So I'm a massive believer in the power of nature in its own sense. Just sitting, you know, in a grassy field, and looking at the view is a restorative experience. And I am not clever enough to be able to say why, but I've spent my whole life experiencing that, and I know it's real.
I interviewed Roy, and because he always talks about the no shit Sherlock studies, it's like all the science that proves that. It's like what we intuitively know, that if we do that, how restorative and, you know, we feel. Carry on.
Well, that intuition is quite an interesting thing. You know, I often say that all I have is intuition, and no one needs to prove it to me. I don't need it proving. I don't need to know why the psychology is evidence that this works, because I experience it, and intuitively I know it's a good thing to do, and it's a good thing for all people to do. And all people need to do is experience it, and they know the same.
But do you sell it in that way, though? That,
no,
you know,
you
like, just trust your intuition.
In fact, you know, we don't sell the outdoors. We don't sell adventure. What we sell is a process that will help people lead more effectively, or form more efficient relationships within a team, or help an organization work in a more profitable manner. So we sell the outcome, and we keep the process as secretive as possible, because until people have experienced it, they probably wouldn't be inclined to believe it. And yet when they've experienced it, they often get hooked on it, and recognize that it should be an important part of their lives. You know, my other philosophy is that organizations are basically collections of people, you know, and if you want to change an organization, you start with the people in that organization. And we have this concept in Impact called liberating human potential.
I love that.
If you can tap into the potential of the human being to decide for themselves what's right, what's wrong, and what we need to do more of, then by default you're going to change the organizations those people work within.
Yeah. And on that, like in terms of Reimaging the future. You've got a view on, the conversations we collectively need to step into as organizations and society.
I think I'm at an interesting place in my life. I've just passed the big 6-0. So inevitably you start to reflect on what you've achieved and what you still want to achieve. I think you kind of move into the altruistic stage of your life, and you start to kind of accelerate some of the activities that you've been spending time doing all of your life, but you realize you haven't got as much of your life left. And so you might want to create a bit more of an impact, to coin a phrase.
Yeah.
And I think against the backdrop of COVID-19, this is a great time for people to reimagine who they are, who they want to be, what changes they would like to make in their lives, what changes they would like to make in the organizations that they work within. And I think we've all been completely amazed at the pivot we've managed to achieve into the virtual world. And we've been able to identify some of the advantages of working in that way, not having to get into the car every morning and drive to work, and the amount of money that's saved in terms of petrol, and the amount of carbon emissions that have been reduced because of that. Not necessarily having to fly to a different country to take a holiday, not having to buy a car full of toilet rolls to survive on. There's been a lot of lessons. It's a horrible backdrop for lessons to be learnt from. People are dying, people are suffering, people are being restricted from seeing members of their family. It's an awful, awful situation for us all to be in. But it's also a learning experience, and we should see it as a learning experience, and we should use it as a way of reimagining our future. And I think there are so many lessons in there that we can extract and use if we choose to do so, that will enable us to live lives that are more kind to the planet, and more caring to ourselves. But that process needs to be intentional. It's not going to happen by magic. There needs to be conversations encouraged in organizations, across groups of people, about what does this mean to us, and what do we want to do differently as a result of it. And the things that give me hope, and I'm not stupid enough to realize that this short in the history of the world lockdown has done anything else other than raise our awareness. But the little stories that give me hope are, the canals of Venice were running clean for a short while, with fish returning to them. And the story I like to tell the most is the one of the killer whales, the orcas, off the point of Gibraltar, who got used to having the sea to themselves, because there were no pleasure yachts and very little shipping moving around. They moved in big time, and different pods of orcas were having a fantastic time playing around in that area of the sea, in that area of the Mediterranean. And then as the pleasure boats returned, as lockdown finished, excuse my French, they were a bit pissed off by it. And they started attacking the pleasure boats and rubbing up alongside them and trying to get them out of their space, Oh, what a fantastic like, just given that short space of time, nature nearly managed to take over again. And so I then move on to, more of a kind of spiritual belief that I have, that may not necessarily be shared by all people, but it's one that I have, and that is that I do believe that nature will always find its own balance. And I think that we have become a force of nature, a powerful force of nature. There are too many of us on this planet, and we are doing too much damage to this planet, and we stand to suffer from that. And in my own view, COVID-19 is an indicator of how nature will restore the balance it needs to restore. for the planet to survive, and that planet can survive with us on it, or it can quite happily survive without us.
Yes. Yeah.
And we have to recognize that we are not in control, but we can make a positive influence, and we can make some decisions now that will enable us to live more in harmony with our neighbors on the planet, instead of continually believing that we are the ones in charge.
Absolutely. And I love that, in terms of it being it can be our pivotal, each individual person's collective pivotal point. Prepared to say about your own healing journey. I think you went on a walk, the Camino de Santiago, at a particular time in your life. And
as you know, my wife had a long battle with cancer. She was first diagnosed with breast cancer 13 years ago. And after some kind of very invasive therapies and operations, was able to return to a normal life for 10 years and with the all clear. But then it returned into her lungs and into her brain. And we had the diagnosis 3 years ago that she would pass away. And she did pass away January this year. So it's been quite a tough year for me coming to terms with that, on top of COVID and all of the threats that's made to the business. But last summer, I was lucky enough to be invited by a few of my old school friends, funnily enough, to participate in what is known as the Camino de Santiago, which is a kind of journey many people participate in. That if you do the whole thing, and I think there are 5 or 6 different ways of doing it, or routes, but if you do the whole thing, then it can literally take you over a month. We chose to do the last week of walking into Santiago, which is the minimum you can do to still get your little certificate at the end of the day. And I must admit, I set off to do this with the very best of intentions, but not really appreciating how important this Camino is in the lives of the people who participate in it. And so we were walking every day for 7 days. And each day we would meet up with different people, and I would talk to them and find out what their story was, and recognize that we all had similar stories. We were all walking for a reason. And again, we were walking through nature, through the Galician countryside, which is beautiful and quite primitive. I saw quite a few farms there that I recognized from my childhood. And that walk, that intentional walk with a finish, helped me to come to terms with what was about to happen and what had been happening. And a lot of that was just being outside, purposely making my way from one place to another, and having the time and the company of people to talk it through with. So it was incredibly powerful experience.
And all different levels, and those walking through landscapes and your own probably emotional landscape as well. Beautiful.
And I chose, I'm a huge introvert, but I chose to do this publicly, and I'm not sure why. I needed to share it with people. And what was interesting was I posted each day on LinkedIn, and LinkedIn is, it's not, I don't do Facebook, but LinkedIn it's a business tool. It's not the kind of place you would expect some guy doing the Camino de Santiago to put in stories. But I put them there anyway, and I didn't know whether it would work or not. And I got thousands of followers on just by telling this story.
Yeah, people want to hear stories. And thank you, Dave. I know you have to go, and so thank you for sharing yours. I'll put the links into Impact International in the episode notes. So we'll pause here and see you back for the next Earth Converse podcast. In the meantime, go out and enjoy nature, one conversation at a time.